Hi. So, as Rosemary said, so a lot of my research is about what does or does not count as accessible, whether or not documents are accessible to people with disabilities, whether or not they can use them. And this is a pretty new concept in cartography. It hasn't really been terribly widely implemented until the past like 20 or 30 years or so. So there's not a lot of historical examples of accessible maps, but what I want to do is think about accessibility more in terms of the whole, the bodily sensorium, I suppose, how you could access it, how different bodies can access maps. So for some context, there are three primary ways that we thought about disability historically. There are other sort of models that expand on this, but these are the three big ones. So the first one is the religious model, or the moral model. This was one that we've used pretty much, this is the oldest model. Disability was viewed as some sort of moral failing, so if somebody was born like without a leg, then that was because their grandfather stole a pig, something like that. In the 1800s, we started thinking about disability more as a biological process, so we transitioned into the medical model. In this model, disability was still thought of as a problem, so these were, the miserable wretches in the street. It was not a divine or metaphysical issue, but it was still thought of as an issue. That transitioned into the social model in the 1960s and 70s as a result of disability activism. Disability wasn't seen as a personal shortcoming, but it was the result of their environment. So if somebody's using a wheelchair, they can't get into a building. That's not because they're using a wheelchair, it's because the building doesn't have a ramp. There's some critiques of this model, but it's generally how we think about disability contemporaneously. There's also a concept that if you've done work either with or for some big corporation like Microsoft or Apple or something, you've probably run across this, which is universal design, and that's the notion that an object should be designed to be usable by anyone regardless of their personal circumstances. The mantra of universal design is that universal design is good design, which means that if an object is designed well, if it follows the tenets of general good design, then it should be accessible to anyone by default from the outset. Again, this has some critiques, but one of them is that it's sort of similar to like the colorblind approach to race, that a designer can say, well, I don't design for people with disabilities, I design for everybody. And of course, that is problematic politically. It can obscure the political and advocacy that people with disabilities still need to deal with. It can also worsen situations in some cases. So if there, for instance, is funding for human assistance in particular situations, and they're replaced by software or machines, then that funding can dry up. And if somebody needs funding for like a particular project or something, it can be harder to obtain after that. It also doesn't exist. It's a utopian idea. You can't ever design something that's usable by absolutely everybody in the world. Whether or not it's a utopia worth striving for is an open question. So with that in mind, I want to think about accessibility in cartography not as a set of criteria that you can go down the list and say like, yes, this is accessible to X, Y, and Z people. But I want to ask the question, how varied are the ways that somebody can interact with a map? And this is a question that you should be asking continuously, that you don't ever really arrive at a conclusion for. You also shouldn't think of it as a score, like, this is accessible to somebody with cerebral palsy and who is blind, as opposed to somebody who is just blind. But you gotta keep going. Because if it's just accessible, that still doesn't necessarily mean that it's a useful map, and vice versa. So this is probably the earliest example of accessible cartography per se. This was designed or it was commissioned in 1837 by Samuel Howe for the Perkins School for the Blind. This is an atlas made to be used by students who are blind. This is a map of Ohio. You can see part of Michigan, sliver of Pennsylvania. This is embossed paper, and you'll notice that there's no Braille on this. It's a Latin script that has been embossed. Braille did exist at the time, but Samuel Howe, he was the head of the school, he believed that if students were taught Braille, then that would further alienate them from society, and that if they learned how to read a Latin alphabet by touch, then they could more easily integrate into society. Obviously, this is not the case anymore. Students are taught Braille. Not a whole lot of blind people know Braille. I think it's less than 50%, actually. But it proved to be more legible than reading a Latin script. If you majored in cartography or geography, or were a geography grad student, you probably know and love these maps. But if not, these are maps, wooden maps of the coast of Greenland on the left, and then on the right is a series of islands off the coast of Greenland. These were made by Inuit people to use to navigate the coasts, and they're designed to be used at night, so they're tactile maps. It's not meant to be designed for blind people necessarily, but it is designed to be used without having to use your eyes. This was designed at the same time as this atlas, so these were contemporaneous. That wasn't the only way that navigators moved around the ocean. Polynesian sailors used song. You might also recall, if you're familiar with the Marshall Island stick charts, that was the maps that we can take photographs of. But they were actually meant to be destroyed. So you would make this chart of ocean swells, and then you would memorize it and then get rid of it. But songs, they would memorize those, use those as well. There's also a case in Canada several years ago. The Gitkasan and Wet'suwet'en First Nations were suing the Canadian government for land rights. There's an issue with that. And part of the evidence that they submitted was a song, the Ayuk, which was an oral history that included a set of laws and territorial claims. This is a political cartoon of the case. In the back, you can see contemporary Western Cartesian maps, and then there's somebody from one of the tribes singing. And they lost the trial, but it went to the Supreme Court, and they won that case. Using song to represent space, we continue to do that today. So Susan Thomas is a musicologist. She wrote about what she calls Havana songs, which is not really a genre, but it's a set of songs that talk about Havana in a very heavily spatialized way. So 537 Cuba, for instance, there's a couple of verses that name landmarks in Havana, and they're ordered in the way that you would encounter them if you actually walk down a particular street. So it's not precise, but also neither was this, and they still managed to use it pretty effectively. So, and it also, song of course carries a lot of affective and expressive information that conventional maps might not be able to convey, or at least in the same way. The notion of terroir was developed officially in France, but has kind of existed for millennia. I like this map. It comes from a book about terroir that was written in the 1800s. I like this map for a couple of reasons. One of them is the fact that the child is eating the cartouche. Really, he has this sort of like, "Father, I require more chocolates" kind of vibe. But also, this is a zoomed-in section of it. This is showing the agricultural products of different parts of France. There's a quote from this book. The author says, "The gourmands of Rome distinguished by taste alone the fish caught between the bridges from that which had been caught lower down. And have we not plenty of gourmands who are able to indicate the latitude under which a wine has ripened?" The actual scientific accuracy of terroir has been disputed in recent years. However, there are some, we do use it to represent space, and you can see this, for instance, in events like these. We use food to represent countries, certain regions, even certain cities. I tried to find examples of food being used to represent certain streets. I couldn't, but I feel like it would exist. But regardless, it's a way of communicating information about a particular place in the same way that a circle would represent a city, and we would have a label next to it. You have a label next to a hunk of cheese that says France, for instance. And I want to end on this map. So this is also from the Perkins School, from the blind. This is a Pushpin map of South America that a student made. This is really significant, actually, because the tools that we use, or the techniques that we use for blind people to create maps today is basically the same. That if somebody who's blind wants to make a map, it's going to be out of using like felt and tinfoil and glue and things like that, which is not inherently a bad thing. Those are very rich textures. But this was made in like the late 1800s, and we still don't have anything that has superseded it, at least one that's been widely implemented. So in revisiting ideas about accessibility, I also want to challenge people to think about accessibility in terms of creation. That there's this kind of implication that if you're working in accessibility, it's about translating documents or things. There's this sort of, I don't know what the word would be, but you're giving access to people with disabilities. And there's very little thought in terms of having people with disabilities actually create things that other people can access. So I'm gonna end there. Thanks.